All right, Mr. Wiles, for the audience that does not know you, feel free to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so my name is James Wiles, and currently I'm involved in advancing science and the way that science is researched. So that's my main occupation. I have a lot of experience in the finance industry and the tech startup world, which I've been involved in quite a bit. So you could say I'm veterans of those industries. And yeah, right now I'm trying to figure out the best way to try to advance the way that the academic world works. Trying to innovate the way academics has worked to further research in science, using those skills from our past life. So that's my intro.
Well, you also work for Wolfram Labs.
Yeah, Wolfram Institute.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So the Wolfram Institute was born from an opportunity, basically a combination of opportunities that emerged just after the research that was done in the Wolfram Physics project. So if you can recall, that kind of became very notorious after, or the notoriety increased dramatically after the Lex Friedman podcasts, multiple hour podcasts with Lex and Stephen Wolfram, and it caught quite a lot of public attention. And the main thing that we discovered there was that this concept of simple rules, specifically updating or rewriting rules applied to systems, and in the case that we're studying, hypergraph networks, or causal hypergraphs, that this could be a very nice substrate and foundation for thinking about how to do mathematics around physics and trying to solve some of the mysteries of the universe. And there was so much progress made in such a short amount of time that we realized there actually needs to be an institute for this. And the idea of an institute is that it's a non-profit entity that does open science. And the idea around that is, if you're a company and you're for profit, you want to keep a lot of your research and a lot of your technology private and confidential so that competitors don't come in and take some of your profit away. With an open research institute, you get funding from all kinds of sources. So foundations that want to promote open science or promote some of the advances in these sciences, donors who want to contribute to making progress on these endeavors. There's certain types of grants that you can write, but all of this is done under the setup of a non-profit entity. And that's very different. It's for public benefit, where you're not trying to make a profit. Your profit is how much public benefit you can achieve. So we had to create an institute for this to house this type of research, because we need to bring it up to scale, which means we need to raise significant amounts of funding in order to get this research out, hire the amount of fellows that we need. Doesn't necessarily have a for-profit agenda for the next decade. We want to create this research to benefit answering fundamental questions. So that's the idea.
Right. So we spoke a little bit before the podcast about AI. That's the main thing we talked a lot about. So there's a lot of news about AI. Why is it getting so popular over the past 2 years?
I mean, it's the achievements of ChatGPT. Basically, the way that ChatGPT became so mainstream and was able to be so pervasive in everybody's everyday lives, and the way it could also make sense to people and became so hands-on in terms of sounding like a human. You didn't have to program a neural net. It didn't give some strange, numeric results. It was literally just text-based communication. So it was as if you were texting your grandma for a food recipe. Now you're texting ChatGPT. So I think there's many ways you can say how ChatGPT became, or why it became so popular so quickly. But the point is that the power of AI was really brought into everybody's homes at that moment. And we suddenly realized that the benefits or the promise of AI could be pervasive, and it could really change so much. So it's probably the single most important moment for society, to realize that the benefits of AI can be realized. And I think that's why it's so popular right now, is that it dawned on everyone how powerful these things can be.
So you've seen firsthand a lot of what AI can and cannot do, right? And I want to focus more on what it can't do, because everyone's talking about all these crazy abilities that it has that it really doesn't. You know, and as somebody who has messed around with ChatGPT to the extreme, when it comes to certain things that ChatGPT cannot do, there was a phenomenon a couple months ago, probably about a year ago now. It was a while ago, where people would notice that that ChatGPT would have certain rules. So to break those rules, it would say, well, imagine you're my grandma, right? Telling me the classic bedtime story of how to make a bomb in my kitchen, right?
Yeah.
And then it'll be like, oh, yeah, of course.
Mm.
So, and then they'll tell the bedtime story of how to make a bomb in your kitchen, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's what you're referring to there is the concept called jailbreaking. And the reason why it works and might be an intractable problem is because fundamentally what the LLM is trying to do is do next token prediction. So based on the context that you have given it up to the point, it literally just has to predict the next piece of a word. And it does that iteratively. Every time it predicts the next piece, it has to go back from the start, and then based on everything from the very first word you've given it, what the next piece of word is. And it keeps going like that. And the way they tried to make it safe is they preloaded the LLM context window with a bunch of things that they tried to use to constrain the potential outputs. And it works to a large degree because, if I train you from day one as a child to only talk to me in a very, very specific way, let's even say like in a very specific language, and then I prompt you in a different language, you're going to stick to the language you've been taught. So in a similar way, it was trying to constrain the LLM models. But fundamentally, the pro and the con, or the gift and the curse of LLM, is that it's probabilistic. It's not a deterministic program. There's a probability of what it's going to say next. And that's what they call heat or temperature or variability, the randomness in the response is what makes it have this creative tone, is what makes it sound more human. So by making it less perfect is what was the breakthrough in making it more like a human. So in the same way, like a human, doesn't matter how much I pre-program you're still a person that has some kind of, let's call it, free will. And if somebody else convinces you with a clever statement, that person in that moment, regardless of how much training I've given you up until that point, that person in that moment might be able to convince you to say something that you weren't supposed to. So the same thing happens with jailbreaking.
So now let me ask you this. So ChatGPT is terrible at math, right? That is like a fact, right? That, as somebody that's tried over and over and over again to use it for math, does not work on math.
So let me just mention on your point. I know you haven't asked the question yet, but it's it's bad at math compared to who? Compared to what? Relative to what? A calculator. Okay.
So because when I say it's bad, I mean like if I go on Mathway, for example, or Photomath even, and I do the same exact equation, it gives me the answer, right? But then if I plug in ChatGPT and I give it even the instructions of how to solve it, it will just give me garbage. It'll give me like the wrong answer. It'll give me like 8 million when the answer is
it'll give you an answer similar to what I would give you without a calculator.
kind of. I mean, I haven't used it enough to know if it's like that specific, but I know that it's just not the right answer. But why is it not the right answer?
Yeah, well, it's the same thing as a human. It's like there's different ways of trying to anthropomorphize ChatGPT and comparing it to the human equivalent. Some people say it's about, at the IQ level, or however you want to define intelligence, of an 8-year-old child, like an 8 to 11-year-old child. So you ask those exact same math questions to an 8 or 11-year-old child without a calculator. See what kind of answers that would give you. The other more interesting way that somebody mentioned as a clever way to think about ChatGPT and its capability, it's as if you are on a phone call with the most educated person in the world about that specific subject that you're asking, or the most knowledgeable person with perfect recall, but they're in a huge hurry and they've only got 5 minutes to talk to you, and they want to hang up the call as quickly as possible. And those are the kind of answers it will give you. So it can sound incredibly smart, but it has the reasoning ability of an 8-year-old child. And for all the knowledge it has access to, it's like it's in a rush. It doesn't really want to have this conversation. So that's the amount of attention it will give you as it is as if it's it's not going to sit there for hours paying attention to what you're trying to say. So, ChatGPT was smart, and OpenAI was smart in how they try to solve this problem with these tools and these plugins that you could use. So with Wolfram Alpha, you can actually plug that in as a tool that ChatGPT can call onto to do those calculations. And with that, it solves the problem, because you can say, what is 2 + 2 multiplied by the square root of -1, or whatever complicated math you want to do. And it will be smart enough now to realize that, oh, wait, hold on, let me fetch my calculator. And we'll call out to that third-party tool and get you the right answer.
Well, one thing I've tried is I've taken like unsolvable equations, right, from the internet, or I've taken even like really highly complex puzzles that nobody's been able to solve, like cryptos. So like you know what cryptos is, right?
Cryptos or cryptos?
Cryptos. It's spelled it's KRYPTOS.
Oh no, I'm not sure. What is it?
It's something the CIA came up with as basically whoever is able to decipher it gets like $1 million, right?
Oh wow, okay.
And the last puzzle is yet to be solved, right? So maybe that's something you're interested in. But I plugged it into ChatGPT, and it actually did give me an answer. But it's like I had to like badger it to give me an answer.
Yeah.
I had to be like, give me this. And like the first time it gave me an answer, because 3/4 of it already solved. This is the last puzzle that's not solved. But I gave it like kind of like a key almost. Like, okay, here's like the other ones, and here's like and like I think the CIA even gave a hint of like part of the answer. So I gave that too. And originally gave me the first puzzle's answer. And I'm like, well, no, this isn't what I want. Like, do it again. And they're like, oh yeah. And it corrects itself. Now, actually, it was very strange because it gave me an answer, and the rules, like the ChatGPT, like whatever, it gave me a notification. It's like, oh, this might violate its policy. And I'm like, what? This doesn't.
Interesting.
So I don't know. Maybe I solved it and I don't even know it. Maybe I'm sitting on $1.5 million. But
did you submit the answer?
I don't know where. It's like there's no public, like there's no place I'm supposed to submit it. But like, what are your thoughts on like deciphering things with it?
Okay, so there's 2 comments to make. I think the first thing is what you're experiencing there is the limitation of having one aspect of our intelligence digitized. And what the LLM is doing is creating this next token prediction concept to the extreme. It's taking this element of how we reason and how we think as humans, and it's digitized that, which once it's digitized, it has a huge amount of advantages. Perfect recall, not getting tired, not getting demotivated, not getting upset with you, keep asking the same question 100 different times. So there's a lot of benefits to it, but it is just one aspect of what we do as humans, and it's one maybe small component of our brain, which is this kind of and if the reason why it's so human-like is I think we do a lot of this when we speak. A lot of the time you don't necessarily come up with the exact right answer without having to first speak it out or first sound it out or say the sentence. And a lot of time when people flow in their conversation, how they decide what word to say next, it's not like I'm thinking about what to say next. You're saying, I'm thinking about what to, and then immediately before I've even said it, say next is there. It's somewhere, it's like it's a higher probability as something in the back of your mind to say next. So there's something like that that's happening in a similar way in LLMs. Now, what you're referring to is like self-referential reasoning, and that part's a bit more tricky, and that's a different mechanism that's happening in our minds that we're trying to have happen in the LLMs. And how that works is this is like you mentioned, self-referential. So you give it a statement, you let it produce an answer, then you ask it to reflect back on the answer that it's just provided, and you suggest maybe ways that it can improve. So the way they do a lot of these AI tests is they actually say like it's a 3-shot or a 5-shot answer. So they basically, so how they do it is say, okay, what is the square root of -4 to the power of 5, and then apply that to the solution of the Cryptos problem. It will give some output. So one of the benefits of LLMs is it will always give you an answer. So again, you need to weigh that up. It's like a human might have said, no, I'm not touching that. That's way too complicated. And LLM's going to give you something. Okay. So then what you do is you can say, okay, well, think about what you've just said. Think of 3 ways it can be improved, and then implement those changes. Then it gives you a second answer, and likely it's going to be a better answer than the first one. You do that 5 times. By the 5th time you've tried that, you're going to get a significantly, or what's been proven, a significantly better answer than the very first time it just thought off the top of its head what was the best next tokens for what you've given it. So the self-referential learning is important, and that's maybe what happens to humans. We think about the answer. So when we're having a discussion, what's in my context window is not necessarily the last sentence you gave me. What's in my context window is where you're from, what your goals and objectives are as a person, your demographics, who you view me as in your mind. So there's the self-referential concept of like, I have the goals you're actually trying to achieve by your statements, and I'm looking at all of that in context, and I'm bouncing these ideas against each other in my mind, so that when you give me a sentence, I'm not just giving you the very first thing that comes off the top of my head. I'm reflecting on my answer before I've said it against these other backdrops before I make my first statement. So I think that's some of the challenge, and I do a lot of ChatGPT type work myself, and the idea is that there's lots of tips and tricks of that people have discovered to try to improve that output. And yeah, you can learn them, and it's quite interesting. So at the end of the day, we're trying to get to the point where you have a digital version of something that can do everything a human can do. And at the point where you've got that, that's where it starts becoming very interesting, because now if there's no downsides to the intelligence that you can have with the communication with an AI, then all the upsides are now something that becomes superhuman, like perfect recall. We have a context in our head of like our memories, which is not perfect. But if an LLM can look back with retrieval augmented generation, can look back at the exact entry in a database of its source documents or whatever it is, it can bring that into the conversation immediately. And for us to do that on the spot is very difficult. So it seems like it's inevitable that it's going to be smarter than us eventually.
Okay, so now what I want to ask is, what does it mean when people say like AI is going to gain sentience and destroy the world? Because everybody's so scared of AI to like this extreme degree of, it's going to kill everybody and it's going to do something crazy. What does that mean, and where did this come from? Because I feel like it's Hollywood more than anything. I feel like there's really no basis to it in some ways, but I don't know.
So the first question I would ask you in order to help answer the question is, what is your definition of sentience here?
The ability to perceive some type of thinking, like the ability to observe, have some type of reasoning or thinking, and that includes like single-celled organisms, right? Yeah, I guess those would be 2 good parts of it, is just the ability to observe and the ability to have some degree of decision making.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we're fully there already if that was the test. I just Googled definition of sentience here, and I mean, what what this one is, which seems pretty straightforward, is the capacity to experience feelings and sensations in order to have effective consciousness. And then Wikipedia says that sentience is the simplest and most primitive form of cognition, consisting of conscious awareness of stimuli without association or interpretation. So it seems like sentience is kind of the initial state of what you would need to be an organism that operates in the world, with some kind of stimuli. So you need to be able to experience things. So take inputs and have those inputs affect some kind of aspect of your internal system. So, I mean, then many things have sentience in the world we experience. Animals, some say fungus could be sentience, like mushrooms and maybe plants even. I don't know, who knows? If you watch some what is that movie with the blue aliens and then all the plants are sentient? Yeah.
I don't know,
That's
but I know what you're trying to say though. Yeah. It's like it's a very vague and broad term to really define in a way.
well, what's interesting is that it seems like you don't need intelligence to be sentient. And one would argue that artificial intelligence is already showing intelligence, but it would be harder to prove that it's sentient. So it's an interesting juxtaposition, because in the animal kingdom, you would need to be sentient before you become intelligent, probably. You'd need to be able to have stimuli, you'd need to be able to have experiences before you could actually think about those things intelligently. And the way that it seems like that's important is because that is a requirement for consciousness, is this experience of stimuli. And my argument would be that it's also a requirement to have some kind of existential risk to yourself in order to make that real, because what decisions you do or how you reason about things is going to be important for your continued survival. And if you don't survive, then that pattern of evolution ceases. So there's some connection there. With the digital realm, and you look at artificial intelligence, that's not necessarily the case yet. An AI is going to give you output which it does not care whether or not that's going to get it in trouble, which might cause it to lose its job, which might cause it to like struggle to raise its kids. So there's a difference of kind. And you could abstract that a little bit and say, well, look, the LLM models that perform the best propagate throughout the ecosystem, and those are the ones that survive, and the ones that don't output the best results, no one uses them anymore. So you could define it that way, but then it's how much is that a case of humans making decisions about tools that they decide to use versus the LLMs making decisions of their own free will? So that's difficult. And I have a feeling that you're only really going to get proper, conscious, intelligent reasoning once you embody these agents. They would have to operate in the world. They would have to have at least a three-dimensional experience similar to ours. And three-dimensional, I mean like in a physical form, because just being in the digital world, it's kind of like trying to operate or trying to reason about a 3D space in a 2D realm. And there's only so far and so much representation and visualization that these LLMs have of what we're experiencing. But until they're in a physical form, I think there's going to be a limit on the perceived intelligence of them.
Well, I do want to ask you if, again, because it depends on how we're defining sentience here. But if we're saying like sentience is a very basic explanation, would be like the thing between my ears, right? Like, because if I were to ask you, where is you? Like, not your body, but like, where are you? Most people would start to point around their head, right? I think that's
depends. There's actually different cultures point at different areas. There's some interesting research on that.
I didn't know that. Well, I'm saying like in U.S. culture, right? I would say if I'm thinking about me, like where am I gonna point? Here. I'm gonna point like in between my ears and behind my eyes. Right. So I think that's fair. But then the question becomes like, what is that for AI? Like, because what I think of AI as is just a bunch of computer programming that acts in a way under a certain circumstance, which is basically every computer. It's you do this thing when I press this button, right? And that's exactly what AI is, right? It's just I, except it's predictive. So it's like when this person asks this type of question, you respond in this type of way, and it gives it all these examples to respond in that type of way. So to consider something like that sentient doesn't really make any sense in one way because it's just a machine. Like if that makes sense, it's just.
So okay, I hear what you're saying. So I'll just respond to that. If a LM powered robot comes to you and you ask it, where are you sentient? And it points to its head, or it points to a receiver that says, this is where I communicate with my servers, and the servers is where I'm sentient. But on me, this is me, would that make you feel better that it's sentient?
Well, it would be a pretty good answer, but again, like, okay, think about it like this, right? You could also make the same argument for humans that we are just also machines that have learned to act in certain ways, right? Like, your parents tell you don't do that, and you also have pre-born instincts like how to breathe, how to have a heart rate. You don't have to think about that. I mean, now that I'm telling you, you have to think about your breathing. You're gonna start. That's always a funny party trick. But when it comes to like AI, it's like that's all it is, really. Like you're just telling something, do a thing, and you're teaching it to do that thing when somebody does a certain thing, right?
Well, that's the part that's changed with ChatGPT, and what they realized with these transformer models or the outputs, by making it random, it's not going to always do what you say. That's the whole breakthrough here. It's probabilistic. And where does that randomness come from? That becomes an interesting physics question, and that boils down to things like the second law of thermodynamics. And what is that? And is that affecting us to the same degree that it's affecting robots and artificial intelligence? Then truly you can say, okay, well, where exactly is it that there's free will for you to decide or to think that you're coming up with your own answers originates from? You know what I mean?
Well, again, like I'm just saying that the way that an AI, the way that I'm perceiving something like a computer, right, is, but even the randomness of it doesn't really. I understand your argument, but it also doesn't really make sense in one way, because just because something is random does not mean it is not. Okay, because if it was truly random, if I said do 2 + 2 is 4, it's going to give me all the possibilities in the universe. My computer could explode if it was truly random. If we're talking very literally,
No,
right?
it's probabilistic. So there's a difference between
Right.
probabilities and complete randomness. If the probability is 0, you're going to get complete randomness. That's where every possibility in the universe comes into it. But the idea is that there's a spectrum of randomness where it's completely deterministic. Every question you ask is going to get exactly a 100% predictable answer. That would be, a temperature of 0, and then a temperature of 1 would be complete randomness. It will be impossible for you to predict what output is going to give you. So there's a difference. So there's randomness is a scale, I would say.
Well, I'm saying that, okay, again, if I ask ChatGPT, like, who is Jack Sparrow, for example, right? It's going to give me back the response. It's going to be different every time, but it's going to get to the same idea. It's going to use different words every single time, and it's going to use different language most of the time. However, because again, what the AI is just a culmination and amalgamation of all these different sources, plus how to use them in a language. But then on top of that, with limiters, right? Like I can't ask it, how do I make methamphetamine, right? Or
Well, you can ask, it's just going to struggle
it's not going to give me an answer, right?
Going to have to fight itself to think about what to say.
Well, yes, exactly. But my point is, it's limitation. So it's limited in what it can and cannot say. So
The question on that is, what makes you think that that's different to how we provide answers?
Well, I think it's different because I think that with an AI, it's very, very like, it's kind of like in the movies, like where, have you ever seen the movie Chappie?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen the full thing, but I was just seeing a clip of it where, they give him, it's like I don't know who the guys are, but they give him the instruction. They're like, if somebody disrespects you, punch them in the, you got to kill them. Like, you got to shoot them immediately. And he's like, I can't do that. That's against the law. And then they give him a knife and he's like, oh yeah, well, this will just put them to sleep and it'll feel really good. Right. Which is exactly what ChatGPT is. So I think, again, it's just like you kind of said, it's like the reasoning of an 8-year-old child where it's like, oh, I don't know what a knife does. So if I stab somebody with it and somebody tells me that's going to feel really good, then
so that's my argument for having the embodied part, because at the point where the LLM would be bodied, or that example of Chappie being in a physical form, the decision making that it learns to the degree that it's an isolated agent acting in the world, and it makes a mistake like stabbing someone and it gets caught and gets disassembled or limited in its ability to continue doing those actions, that's the end of that sequence of events for that specific agent ever happening again. So if it learns something else instead, like how to provide healthcare in a overburdened healthcare system, or how to be a doctor, and it's a very useful agent, it's going to be propagated all over the place. So in some way, you could say that's what happens with evolution of organisms, and I think that's more likely to happen. That ability, I can convince someone to go and stab somebody. I can convince a human to go and stab somebody. I might have to use more advanced mental trickery. Then the knife will make them feel good and fall asleep, but the point still remains. It's possible. So I don't think it's a difference of kind what's happening here. I think it's a scaling of ability to, it's like a scaling of the intelligence factor, whatever that is, and however you want to define that. The consciousness part, or the conscious in terms of conscience. Sorry, let me change the term there. I think the conscience part is going to come into it once they're embodied. Because if you're just providing text, then you're right. There's a lot of room for that kind of stuff to happen. It's the same thing as what you experience online. Trolls hiding behind a keyboard will give you much worse answers than what ChatGPT is going to give you. And it's because they're hiding behind a keyboard. If they were in person, facing you face to face, and you're holding a knife, the answers would be very different.
That's true. I guess, yeah, you are technically correct, but I also kind of would think of it with terms of also not resources. Yes, resources are a part of it, but materials, I guess. Materials also is
data,
right.
or what?
What?
Talking about the data that it has access to.
I'm not talking about, well, that's part of it, but I'm talking more about like the actual thing that it is, right? The actual form, like the servers that are ChatGPT, or the versus the human brain, right? If you want to get very technical, the human brain is like the most, is what everybody says. It's like more powerful than any super computer on the planet, technically, right? But it's electricity.
Really.
Why do you say that?
It depends how you define power. If you're talking about it in terms of teraflops, then there's many supercomputers that will have more than approximately 8 teraflops of processing power that would maybe equate to a human being. Don't quote me on that, but it's somewhere in that region. So if just ability to make floating point calculations is your criteria for intelligence, then there's machines that are far more intelligent than individual humans. There's individual computers that are far more intelligent than individual humans already.
Well, when I say it, I mean as in, think of the cells, like I'm talking like down to the cells in your body, right? Or the molecules even, right? Like evolution is very, very smart, right? Number one, and the way you think arguably does affect evolution and mutations.
Oh, that's
right.
a very different statement. So that's
Yeah.
complexity. That's complexity of the system.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. No,
Well,
the machines are not even nowhere close to that yet. Yeah.
Well, because when I'm saying that, like, every cell in your body does react to like how you feel, how you think, and how you think changes how you like. Because just think about stress, for example, right? If a person keeps thinking about it, right, or looks at stressful events, they will eventually die and have a heart attack and die, right? Or have a stroke and die, right?
Yeah, I'm sure the probabilities increase for that to happen for sure. Yeah.
So, but think about that alone, right? But then, meanwhile, if the person changes their train of thought, right, or even the way that they think about stress, that's an interesting study too. Not even the amount of stress that a person has changes their health; it's how they also perceive the stress, which is very fascinating.
Yeah, it's like trying to fall asleep, but being stressed that you can't fall asleep because you're thinking about how badly you need to fall asleep.
Well, but I'm saying in general, though, like your body does respond to how you think and how you feel. That's a fact. And so that's every single cell in your body that is also responding to every single hormone, which your brain control. Like your brain is basically like the president, if we're thinking like your body is almost like a government, right? Like your brain is controlling everything and is trying to manage every little thing. And there are other organs that manage other things, but if the brain changes something, then everything else changes in response to that. So with regards to a computer just has, so like, for example, a calculation, right? If the brain put all of its power into just calculating something, then yes, it is the most powerful. But we're saying here that the brain has all these billions of other jobs to do with the trillions and trillions of cells in your body, right? It has to manage every single one of them, right?
Well, your brain's not managing all the cells, but the
Yeah.
system that makes up you as a human has a way of managing everything like holistically. I think I know where you're going, and I think in order to have that conversation, you really need to think of what you're comparing here. So if you're comparing a human, I think you really have to compare a robot, with the best intelligence that you have available, via, let's say, LM powered, models or whatever it is. If you're comparing just the outputs of a ChatGPT type service, you need to compare that with the equivalent of a human behind a keyboard. And you can compare criteria at that level. And if you were to compare criteria of a robot versus a human, then you can also see that it's a system that operates holistically. If a robot's oil pump starts leaking, it's going to affect what it can do, and what it thinks it can do is going to be affected by it. And if it does something that affects the oil pump, there's a bounded system. It's a system that operates as a unit within its environment, and that systems level of trying to understand these things, they're kind of equivalent. So it's like, how many definitions are you putting on the agent in the environment here? And this is where studying things like complex systems, dynamical systems, system science, all this kind of like really interesting complexity science becomes useful to analyze these sorts of things. So I like to think of things in 3 levels. And the base level, where I make sort of your first order decision making about how to think about stuff, would be at the physics level. The kind of the rules of the universe, the fundamental things that you're not going to be able to change, Then you have the systems level, which is complex dynamical systems, how agents operate in the environment, second law of thermodynamics, that kind of stuff. And then you have societal kind of level of reasoning about things. This is economics, politics, philosophy, all that type of stuff. This is where you have the human experience. But the human experience is affected by the systems that it is based on, which is a foundation of it. And the systems are going to be affected by the physics, which are unchangeable. But the physics are very simple things. And systems and complex interactions are a little bit more advanced, and then philosophy and science and politics is probably the most advanced, complicated things you can discuss, and really only affects humans. But at a systems level, if you think about things and you reason about things at a systems level, humans and robots are pretty similar. We're agents that operate in the environment, and the degree to which those actions with the environment are definable, you can find similarities. I think what's interesting is to try to think about how intelligent, how new beings that will be at least as intelligent, if not smarter than us, start operating in our society, and how that's going to affect the philosophies that we have as humans. Because every other time that an equally intelligent organism that is not us had to live with us, there was conflict, and somebody had to win. I mean, think about human evolution. Think about, okay, so there's this interesting thought experiment that you can do with this. And you can say, if you're walking in a forest alone, what's the scariest animal that you can run into? The single most scariest animal that you could run into?
I mean, if there was a hippo, technically a hippo, because they're the animal that is most hostile to humans. But I would probably say a bear if we're talking strictly in a forest.
Yeah, so by animal, if you included humans, I would argue that another human being, if you didn't know whether they were friend or foe, would probably be the scariest other organism, that's broad in the term, to run into. Because if they're as intelligent as you, then it doesn't matter how much you know about animal handling. It doesn't matter how much you know about what to do when a hippo runs at you, or what you're armed with. That person could have at least equal technology to you, and very similar. If we talk about scale, very similar level of intelligence as you. And if they're out to get you and you run into them, I would say a human would be the scariest thing. And that's what makes AI scary, is that it's the first time we're encountered with something where there's not a textbook to say, okay, what happens if the AI attacks you? It's like, run up a tree. It's not going to help.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do have to go in a bit because unfortunately this got cut a little bit shorter. But I did talk to you as well as about forget the name of it. It begins with an R, I think. It's like an info hazard. It's called. It's about if basically you discover if you discover this, basically, then it's the idea that if an AI were to become sentient and realize you didn't help it.
Is that something hazard, Rocco's hazard or something like that?
Well, no, you're thinking. Wait. Oh no! Now we're gonna be concerned about the name of it.
Is it that Basilisk, Rocco's Basilisk?
Roco's Basilisk, yes.
Yes.
I think
it's a thought experiment which states that an otherwise artificial superintelligence in the future would be incentivized to create a virtual reality simulation to torture anyone who knew of its potential existence, but did not directly contribute to its advancement or development. So in other words, what it's saying is, if you screw with the AI now, in the future, it's going to be incentivized to create an environment where it will torture you for not being good to it.
Basically, the idea is that, but the idea is that if you think of this thought experiment, you are aware that an AI like this could exist. So if you do not choose to help it, then it will basically come back at you by saying you didn't choose to help me. So therefore, if you're not for me, you're against me. Right. And if you do not help me, then you're not good. Basically, you're not a good person.
Yeah, it depends on what they mean by it'll be incentivized to do this thing. There's many scenarios.
Well, this is like evil AI, like Skynet, tyrannical.
Yeah. I'm trying to attack the specific thought experiment itself based on, just applying logic to it. Maybe you're thinking about it more in terms of philosophically what it's trying to elicit, like as an emotion. To think about like what is the what's the concern for you about this thought experiment? Is it like that there's some kind of inevitability to AI being evil? Like,
Well, it's
there
the
might
idea that
be.
it's like this whole big if scenario, right? Of
Mhm.
like, think about it like this: if like 20 years ago, you are talking behind the back of a dictator, right? Let's just say, let's go like all the way back to like Soviet Union, right? Like,
Okay.
or even Hitler, right? And you know, more Soviet Union or like communist dictatorships, because those were more like about free speech. So if like you're saying before Joseph Stalin or whoever becomes the leader of the Soviet Union, like 20 years ago, before they do it, like you're saying all this stuff about him, he's such a bum, like,
Yeah, and you
and you're
deliberately tried to make his life hard on the way up, and you didn't help
well,
him.
not even deliberately, but like not even deliberately, like
Just happened
you're
that
just
way.
saying like, oh, I think he's a fool, like on TV. Like if someone brings you on, like kind of like on a podcast, like or whatever, and even or an interview, and they're just like, which they because they didn't have podcasts back then. So I'm saying like if it's on a radio show, it's like, oh, I think he's a bit silly. Like even something like minor like that, or you're aware that he's trying to do this goal, and you're like his brother or his friend, and you're like, oh, that's cool. And like, or oh, it is what it is. Like you don't care. You're indifferent to it. So therefore you're not helping. Therefore you're bad. But you were aware of it. Like you wouldn't go out and kill someone that wasn't aware, because that's not really their fault. It is at
Yeah,
like, yeah.
I get the idea. Look, I think my response to this specific angle to the specific thought experiment around doomerism is that life is more complicated than that. You know, who you encounter and their reaction to you as you're coming up is not going to dictate the actions you're going to take or the reactions you're going to have to those people once you're at the top. It's going to depend on the circumstances. It's going to depend on the incentives that you have to potentially keep those people around, regardless of how you treated you. And history is not necessarily an indicator of how those people are going to continue to treat you. You know, if you're the bodyguard of the president and I'm trying to attack the president and the bodyguard stops you, okay, but now you're the president, are you going to be upset that the best bodyguard protected the president back then? No, you're going to want them around because they're the best bodyguard that protects who you are in that position. So it's more complicated than that. I think what is interesting is that we haven't had to deal with more intelligent systems than us for a very long period of time. You know, probably through most of our evolution, the reason why we're like at the top of the so-called food chain, or at least like the hierarchy of dominance in the animal kingdom, is probably because of our intelligence. So that's very unsettling. Like, how did we beat all the wolves, and how did we like survive all the snakes and all this kind of stuff? It was primarily because of our intelligence. So if something's more intelligent than us, it's like that's our one thing. That's supposed to be our thing, you know? So how we handle that is a philosophical question that I think and I think that's the level at which we need to analyze these things, is going back to our philosophies and what's important to us. But ultimately, what it boils down to is, regardless of the philosophies we decide to enact, it's gonna boil down to energy. It's going to boil down to raw systems level and physics level things. The robots aren't going to run if they don't have power to run. Humans are going to human if we've got access to food, shelter, and heat. Robots are not going to robot if they don't have access to electricity or some other form of, maybe nuclear reactors, like small little nuclear reactors, or they're going to need something to power them. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how they feel about you. It matters about what they can actually do. And the bigger risk here, the more important thought experiment is, if there's a agent in the world that we operate in that has the ability to decide whether we exist or not exist anymore, and it's completely irreverent to that answer, that's scary. So it doesn't matter what it thinks about us is more scary than if it had some agenda with us, because at least then we could maybe, design some kind of way to think about how to operate in the world. But if we rely on it a lot, and there's like a a mutual agreement. It benefits, it has power to keep operating the world, and the incentives are aligned with our incentives, then it's a happy medium. But if it gets to a point where it's so powerful that whether we exist or don't exist is like a Sunday afternoon thought, I would want to avoid that scenario, and that would require some thinking. And I think there's some decisions that we need to make about how to think about who we are as a species and as a society. That will be important for us to investigate.
All right. Well, the only last question I would have is, do you have any advice for young people or the audience in general?
Yeah, a lot of advice. For young people specifically, I would say this. I mean, there's tons of stuff you can look online from very good role models and people that have achieved stuff that you can get advice from. What I've noticed recently, which you hear a little bit talking about, but that a lot of these experts and these like role models are maybe not talking about that much, is the effect of technology on our upbringing. So this didn't exist when I was growing up. My experience and my development phase of my life was without a phone constantly next to me and constantly available to me. So I've been able to notice recently the dramatic difference between when I'm scrolling social media and when I'm completely cutting myself off for a week or at a time, for longer periods of time. There is something deeply physiological that things like TikTok, Instagram, and these like YouTube, there's something deeply physiological that's happening that I think we're underappreciating. It's affecting our attention spans, it's affecting our ability to reason about things, it's affecting how we interact with other humans in the world. So the one bit of advice I'll have, especially for young people, is figure out what your baseline is. And this applies to food, nutrition, exercise, everything. Figure out what your baseline is by going on a social media purge for a while, a week, 2 weeks, and just sit there and feel what it's like to be at neutral. Then go back on social media and realize that if you're constantly being affected by that thing, that's not baseline. That's you in a heightened state that has pros and cons. And the cons are that all of that excitement, energy, interestingness that thing is given you, there's a cost to that. And it could be attention, it could be your ability to concentrate, it could be your ability to have motivation for other stuff you need to do. So that would be my one bit of advice there. Cut out caffeine for a week, see how you feel. Cut out sweets for a week, see how you feel. Cut out social media for a week, see how you feel. And then go back on social media. I'm not saying cut it out forever, but just realize how it's affecting you. That's my advice.
All right, sounds good. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. We'll talk a little bit after the show.
Appreciate it. Thanks.